Hello, and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This is a companion to my Let's Play, and it is going to spoil the entire whole dang game, which will definitely be coming up quite a bit in this episode. So definitely do not continue watching if you don't know the story of the game. You won't even have context for a lot of the stuff I say, let alone it being actual spoilers. Content warnings for abuse, incest, rape, grooming. There are timestamps in the video description indicating which sections have which content warnings. The short version is one has a brief reference to abuse, and the rest are in a particular section. Both are marked below, and you can skip ahead as necessary. Before we get actually on to part 6, I want to rewind to the last video, because in the comments something was posted that is going to feed into this current video and some stuff I'll be talking about later, where Corey Coleman said, "It is stated in the manga, Kinzo suspected Yasu was his child/grandchild when Kanon and Kinzo practiced firing the Winchesters together. Kanon's physical body has scars where his 6th toes were removed. Kanon had to take his shoes off, and Kinzo saw that. And obviously, as they say, 6 toes are common in Kinzo's bloodline. Do the math." So this is interesting because at least one theory or line of thought I had was that Kinzo might have known or somewhat known that his grandchild was there, but had not kind of awakened as Beatrice. So that's an interesting angle on things. That's from the manga, so it's obviously not from the game itself, but Ryukishi was involved in writing the manga, so that feels reliable enough. The canonicity of Umineko in general is obviously in question, as we will dig into more and more. I at least feel confident that it's worth putting in contention and thinking about, because I had already imagined at least a scenario where Kinzo does know or suspects and is kind of using the riddle to suss that out more than having no clue and it being a complete shot in the dark kind of thing. Okay, so on to part 6. Battler's resistance to the idea of witches. It starts coming up here kind of a little bit more concretely. We get a little bit in this section about Battler being stubborn, and this is where his earlier negligent kind of abuse might be strong for it. Given what happened to Shannon, I don't think it's entirely too strong to call it abuse, but his negligent harm that he is doing to people, it comes up in here when he is unable to help himself saying things that make it clear he doesn't believe in Beatrice, even as it is clearly deeply upsetting to Maria. And later, Battler will make the kind of Santa Claus comparison of oh, it's like if you told a child that Santa Claus wasn't real on Christmas Eve, that would be shitty. Wouldn't really achieve anything. It would feel like you're asserting a truth, but it's for no meaningful value. Piercing the illusion of Beatrice, much like piercing the illusion of Santa Claus, is not like a moral good. It, again, thinking in terms mostly of the idea of Beatrice as a myth, as a witch legend at this point, from Battler's point of view, that's all it is. By denying that legend, Battler's not really doing anything of value. He's not really, even from his own point of view, actually, educating Maria. It's not like he's teaching her a degree of skepticism that would be valuable in life or something. He's just, unable to help asserting it. And he reveals later that part of that is because he feels like believing in Beatrice is a childish thing he did when he was younger, so he now needs to conform to everyone else's understanding of it as a silly legend, because if he doesn't, he'll feel like a child. He is again posturing, he needs to feel like an adult, he needs to think he's a grown-up because he's been gone for 6 years. Literally, he is coming back when he is 18 to meet all these people. He was last here when he was 12. He wasn't even a teenager when he last saw his family. So he is trying to make like a really distinct marker of growth. Not necessarily in like a particular maturity sense, really, just in the sense of not child. And the reason this is so harmful to Maria is that Maria has a self-image that is built on the idea of witches. And it relates strongly to Beatrice's personhood. It's a genuine personhood that Beatrice holds, but someone could just deny her, theoretically undoing her existence. Which, obviously, we're going to be seeing with Madler, where he will repeatedly deny her and insist that there's no way and it's all nonsense and none of it makes any sense. This is effectively what he's doing to Maria, less intentionally, less overtly, but he is effectively saying, look Maria, I know you want to grow up to be a witch, but it's ridiculous and there's no such thing, so stop even thinking about that. At this point, and as we continue, we are going to be asking, what is a witch? In this section they do kind of ask, like, what could witch really be a stand-in for? Could it just mean a shrewd and generous person who might have helped Kinzo in a kind of mysterious and magical way, but is mostly a metaphor for a woman who showed him kindness? As we go on, my overall understanding of witches is more of an idea of self-actualizing a particular identity, especially one from the point of view of a child or your child self. Ava Beatrice will be a really big indicator of how complicated this idea can get. But because we have not gotten to even the first witch being on screen, for now I will just say, my running understanding of witches is it's about self-actualizing a confident version of yourself, a kind of idealized form of what you would become, what you could be. And at least for Maria, this makes a lot of sense. Maria is a person who is the youngest of her whole family. She's quite low in the totem pole. She is looked down on, she's condescended to, she is misunderstood, she is punished and abused because she cannot conform correctly to her role. And she doesn't really have a lot of friends from school or anything. So of course, Maria wants to see a future where she will be a powerful witch. If I'm remembering right, she has already talked to Beatrice on previous visits to the island. So she has seen a person who has self-actualized into being a witch and is like 100% that's me, that's what I want. We saw her earlier identifying with Canon, and it's because she wants to see peers who she feels like she is aligned with and could grow up to be and is a positive path for her future. Because most of what she is being given and told and seeing is people telling her the things she should not be doing, and they're basically all of her instincts, the things she cares about. It's like, no, the way you're doing things is all wrong, stop it, and just do the normal thing. So with The Legend of the Gold, there's some interesting layers of the story happening here. Because both in the conversation here with the kids, and then later in the conversation with the parents, they both discuss The Legend of the Gold, and they both pick and choose elements of the narrative. No one believes it's 100% as straightforward as the hearsay about it. But here with the kids, you do get them kind of identifying, well, this could make sense and this part could be a metaphor. A witch could just be how he chose to describe this person, whereas the mountain of gold could be like purely metaphorical, or could be symbolic of a much smaller thing, and could be a case of exaggerating, like a large sum of money that was very generously loaned. Which is very funny because we know that the gold is real. We know that actually the mountain of gold, one of the most fantastical elements of this story, is exceedingly true. The idea of the witch representing a human person is also true, though, because Beatrice existed as a human woman. So no one knows the true story, including probably us, because the later version we're going to get of the story is almost certainly like slightly massaged and dressed up, but is hues closer to what I imagine the facts would be. But, I mean, even like with what I just said, what I imagined the facts would be, we are all picking and choosing what seems to hold together as the narrative. At the end of the day, any narrative is going to be you making a coherent thread of events where you're kind of figuring out, well, what actually makes sense? How do I understand the world to work, and what can kind of make these disparate elements hang together? If you have a notion of a witch, you have a notion of a mountain of gold, you know that your grandfather has restored a family from very little funds, no like connections or whatever. Obviously something miraculous has happened. How do you then string that together as a thing that you could confidently tell people happened without them going, what the hell are you talking about? And the thing that's particularly funny about that is, it's not that the gold is impossible, obviously, since it is literally true, but it's that the gold is inconceivable. You could tell the story of, oh, so the Italian government hoarded up a bunch of gold when they knew they were about to lose, and right there someone would stop you and be like, you expect me to believe this? Because that is an incredibly plausible but inconceivable version of events, which a lot of that is going to happen later with Battler and Beatrice and their game and how he tries to wriggle out of situations, but it's already present here because no one believes the gold. You don't have enough facts that make you able to piece together the narrative where you could understand having this much gold collected in one location. And so in the absence of that, you just treat that as absolutely a metaphorical, mythical, or false part of the story. And an interesting thing about that is it's people do go the full length of not just saying it's like, that seems ridiculous, it's just probably not true. They go like, it is effectively impossible because it is so inconceivable. But the actual truth is, it's incredibly possible. It's just, of course, one of Kinzo's style of magic where it is an incredibly unlikely situation, and from unlikely situations of risk, immense magic is born. Speaking of Kinzo's magic, another running question I have is, how much does Kinzo believe in the black magic tales? How much does he sincerely believe that actual magical effects, well, I don't know how to word this, does he describe events as magical because of their chance and risk? Is that just his description of the world? Is that the aesthetic wrapping he is putting on things that are happening? Or does he truly believe in a degree of magic? He seems to have had a belief in the idea that Beatrice actually reincarnated. Unhealthily so. Or that she could reincarnate and that he was attempting to make it happen. Which goes beyond the idea that you could use black magic stories as a kind of coherent narrative thread to like tie together things. Kraus will claim at one point that their father started describing the gold in black magic terms to kind of disguise the fact that, to disguise what really happened and to make people just entirely dismiss the story, because then it would just sound too ridiculous to believe any element of it. But in another vein, is it possible that Kinzo has convinced himself of the magic because it is a way to absolve himself of some horrific things he has done? He has inflicted terrible abuse and trauma, and rather than reckon with that, if he manages to sincerely believe that Beatrice actually revived, then what he did is not, strictly speaking, the kind of trauma that it actually was. And I mean, on a somewhat related note, he refers to exchanging his soul, which I just briefly will pick apart, because did he sell his soul because he did bad things, such as abuse and incest and holding someone effectively prisoner, but also killing fellow soldiers to keep his hands on gold? it is not clear to us exactly how dirty his hands got in that situation, because him and Beatrice are the only ones who made it out to tell the tale, and we only even hear his version of events there. But in a kind of different reading of that line too, exchanging souls is arguably what someone does in a Christian marriage, when you and your partner are bound together by souls. And Kinzo did build a chapel that has to have been for Beatrice. There's a fun discussion here where they actually talk about the impracticality of gold as a valuable substance. I mean, aside from kind of the weight, the material concerns, there's an important distinction made where gold itself doesn't have much inherent value. It's a symbolic value. It's valued because it's rare. And it has certain uses and can do things, but is mostly a commodity because there's so little of it that by having some gold, you have an expensive, difficult to access item. And so it is more of a symbol of wealth. It is alluring in a way that a bank card with a bunch of money on it is not inherently alluring, because it's incredibly valuable, incredibly useful, very easy to do things with. But a mountain of gold feels like the prestigious amount of wealth that this kind of family wants and strives for. It feels like a license to do anything. It feels like it empowers you to take any kind of control you would like of things. This is a family of people who have messed up in their businesses in various ways, to the point that they're all in debt, they're all in a hole, and they need to pay off a significant sum of money. But if they had a mountain of gold, that problem would be meaningless. The feeling, at least, is that they could just do almost anything they wanted. However, it is a symbol. It is not money. You cannot buy property with gold bars. You would have to take the incredibly heavy, blocky substance from this remote-ass island, which, by the way, you have to get to with a plane and a boat. Like a small plane and a boat. It's not easy. And you then have to convert it to money, you have to sell it. But of course, if you sell it all very quickly, you're flooding the market and you will undermine the value of the very thing you are selling, and it'll kind of just scupper things. And that's not to mention the fact that if you actually come out with this huge quantity of gold, you will almost certainly have people who are like, where did you get this? Oh, look, it's Nazi gold. Let me tell you, you don't get to keep that. You don't get to spend it. So realistically, if you wanted to use this gold for anything of practical value, you would end up having to do similar to what Kinzo did, and using its symbolic power. Take a piece of it, tell someone that it exists, show them the piece, let them prove it's true, show them the whole mountain, and then be like, okay, now give me money, because you know I'm good to pay you back with a fuck ton of gold. Because at the end of the day, you need real, and heavy scare quotes around real, you need real money, you need usable money. Money itself is, of course, just a convenient form of symbolic power. Money could also just go up in smoke, like if the economy collapsed, your money becomes worthless. That's all very true. But it's at least very easy to spend that money quickly and unsuspiciously. And the other thing about the massive mountain of gold is that it not only symbolizes like a huge capability, but it even in itself symbolizes a kind of excess. You could not conceivably need that much gold. But what if you had it? What if you could have that degree of access to resources that you could spend wherever and whenever and however you wished? And this is why later we'll see siblings tearing each other apart over the greed of this mountain of gold, because it is by far and away more money than any of them could have wanted. Much more than they're asking, much more than they're blackmailing out of Kraus. So it 10 times over many times over would solve their immediate money problems and keep them flush for potential problems in the future and fund their businesses. But they don't want that. They want the entire cake as soon as they've seen it's there. Especially when they start to get paranoid that their other siblings might also want the entire thing. When we get to those scenes, it'll be interesting to see the ways in which that's not actually true of all of them. We will see later when Ava first discovers the gold, Rosa also does too. And in my understanding, Rosa is a lot more happy to share, especially as the youngest sibling. She's been sharing things her whole life, but is wary because she knows Ava is not. She knows the extent to which Ava would not be happy to share, and in part, Ava doesn't want to share because she's concerned that if she attempts to share, she won't get her due. And so they're simultaneously being very greedy about things, but also suspicious of their siblings' own greed and how that may undercut their own share. Also, Kyrie and Rudolph are a lot more pragmatic, because they'll just shoot everyone and then take the cards with money on them and be like, this is just easier. Let's just sink the gold, who gives a shit? That's going to be a very fun scene to dig into later. So with the parents talking about the legend of the gold, an interesting aspect of it that emerges is, like with the kids earlier, they're picking and choosing aspects of the story that seem suitable. But it's less about trying to string together something coherent because they just don't really believe in the legend, and it's more about using the legend as a kind of cover story. What is happening here is that they are blackmailing Kraus. They know that he has been embezzling money. Rather than directly try to get him charged with embezzlement and deal with all of that, which won't actually profit them directly, they're instead attempting to leverage this thing they're aware of to their benefit. And to do that, they're basically telling Kraus, here's a story we can string together. None of us believe it, but we can provide sufficient justification that this narrative is how you have gotten your money, and we will agree to believe it. We will agree to accept it. We will all share in this story none of us believes is true, and in doing so, you will get to keep protected and you will pay us money. And this is kind of unconcerned with any idea of objective facts, which, let's not get into the reality of what is and is not objective, if anything at all. But they will employ some, like, dubious justifications as facts. They'll employ hearsay, like, such and such a person was shown the gold, and that must be the case, because his initial loan was so mysterious, something magical must have happened to make it work, and a respected businessman would not be a partner in fraud. So it's absolutely not true that this man was, like, lying or was helping Kinzo get a leg up without any actual collateral in place. None of that's, like, actually definitive proof. All of that's just justification. Aspects of a story you could tell that would be like, yeah, this makes sense in a story, but if you're actually telling me to believe this legend of the gold, this is really not a lot to go on. Especially because the mountain of gold is such an unbelievable thing that if you actually wanted, like, airtight proof of it, there's a strong burden of evidence there. Because as a baseline, it is so unbelievable that the idea that you'd say, well, this guy saw it and he must be trustworthy, is, like, so little in the face of how much questions this mountain of gold would beg. But they don't really need to prove the story, because they're not trying to convince Kraus that it's true, they're just trying to get Kraus to accept the narrative. They're like, hey, what if we all said this is what happened, and none of us questioned it, and we didn't go any deeper on it, and we just accepted it and moved on, and then went along with this story. And they want that because it fits their goals and intentions. It's a lot more of a cynical thing than what the children were doing earlier, because the children were just, out of curiosity, teasing out like, oh hey, what could this story be? What could it mean? What could it say about our grandfather? What parts could be true or not? They're manipulating the story in this case to try and get specific goals and ends. It's funny that there's even a little minor contrast that when it comes to Krause's dire financial situation, they have research, facts, investigations. They need to confirm his financial situation because they are very invested in the truth of that and being able to counter his attempts to hide it. And as we saw earlier, the value of the gold is all made up, which is just even more funny when you have the siblings here inventing gold, then inventing shares of it, inventing this symbolically large source of money, imagining Krause has it, then talking about how they'd share it out, and being so generous as to give Krause 5 times as much as any of the rest of them. But they're giving him 5 times as much as nothing. They don't believe this gold exists. The numbers are all made up, but they're made up in a funny way where they're invented to make it seem like they are being generous to him and to diminish the amount they're asking from him. If you talk about him having a 20 billion yen mountain of gold, and all they want is 250 million each, he only needs 750 million? That's not that much. That's quite little compared to the total mountain of gold. But of course, he doesn't have a mountain of gold, and so that's a lot of money. But they've just used their narrative framing and justification to try and minimize what they're even asking of him, to portray it as just a little piecemeal sum that's just to kind of make them happy. Which is one of the things you can do with stories, is you can frame them and use them to make certain things seem reasonable by contrasting them to other elements of the story. Even though if it did work, they would be getting a lot of money out of Krause with this blackmail. And a thing I love in the scene when all of this is going on is that Krause knows the gold is real! Krause has a single gold bar that he knows is one of many. He's not like definitively certain that the mountain exists or that it's definitely 10 tons, but he knows that at least one gold bar existed, and so he is convinced that there is more to find. And none of the other siblings are. The rest of them see it as a fairy tale made up nonsense that they've long since given up on. But Krause, who lives on this island, who has no doubt searched for it and not found a single hint of it yet, aside from this one bar of gold, is still a believer. So he simultaneously has to call their bluff because he wants to ensure that they don't believe it's real, which they don't. And also he kind of wants to make sure that on the off chance he did find the gold, none of them is then going to come around and be like, wait, hang on, we are not splitting this the way we talked about. You are not getting 5 times as much as the rest of us. Because they absolutely would go back on that and be like, well, of course we were fucking lying. We didn't mean any of that. And if he even so much as slightly suggested that the gold was real, they would all be on top of looking for that gold. And as a final note on this scene, I do like the very minor parallel that there's a lot of people gathering around insisting that Krause signs a contract, which later Battler will be surrounded by witches who are insisting he sign a contract. I'm looking forward to that scene so much. So, here's where the comment from the start of this episode comes back. Kinzo's miracle and the Epitaph. What is unclear, or ambiguous I should say, is how much Kinzo knows and what he wants here. The comment I read from before definitely points in a particular direction, that Kinzo was aware of his biological grandchild, but who does not embody Beatrice at the time of him making this portrait. We will have to keep a more direct eye on the timeline as we go, because as of yet, I don't currently remember when Beatrice III started distinctly manifesting. Like, when did Beatrice III become a person who was actually embodied? But we know that Kinzo is broadly aware of his grandchild, and so this epitaph is a form of resurrecting Beatrice by basically drawing Beatrice out of the biological grandchild who could theoretically be a vessel, to use a gross word, the vessel that is Canon and Shannon's body. It's pretty pointed that this conversation is between Kinzo and Canon, and Kinzo is suggesting, hey, have you tried solving this riddle? And Canon is saying he cannot. We'll see later that Canon's a little bit more resistant to Beatrice than Shannon is. I am very curious about that dynamic now that I understand that they share a body, because that is ripe with meaning. But for the moment, we can take this as Canon himself is not anywhere near being capable of solving this riddle, at least at this point in time. It's worth remembering that Kinzo is dead at this point. His body has died quite a while ago. So the question at that point would be then, is this person an echo of Kinzo's will? Is this just an echo of the fact of what people know about the Epitaph and what people understand to be true? I'm more inclined to think that than to think this might be, say, Genji specifically embodying Kinzo and trying to push Canon to solving the Epitaph, because this is just the unclear echoes of what Kinzo was attempting to say with the Epitaph but was not being direct about. And so, as a means to revive Beatrice, the Epitaph kind of is a test to effectively see, can you puzzle out this riddle, which involves some information of knowing Kinzo, like understanding his hometown and what that would mean, in a way that, say, some stranger wouldn't, but Beatrice would. There's gruesome language all through the Epitaph, but I think that's more meant to be just Kinzo's kind of black magic aesthetic. We know that the kill will actually refer to the mechanism for a puzzle that, I don't know, you could use the word disable or remove, I think? I don't remember the specifics of how the mechanism works. But by using the word kill, it evokes a black magic ritual that is actually technically about something more mundane. Nanjo comments on this in a funny way, where he will ask, why did he have something so provocative written? Which is funny because you could also say that about Umineko as it plays out, as there's a lot of quite violent scenes, there's a lot of fight scenes, and the thing is that you need the aesthetic trappings to sell a game, and I don't mean in the capitalist sense, I mean in the sense of getting people to buy in and invest in a story. Umineko is dense with themes, but has a lot of surface level enjoyment on top of that too, because it's quite a long visual novel. A lot of the surface level, like writing, is fun and enjoyable, as is the art and the music. The art may depend on which version you've got, I guess. But by having those things on the surface level, you will get a reader to stick around and stay invested and look at the deeper levels. Ryukishi could just write an essay if he really just wanted to, like, make an argument about readers and authors and the relationship between and trust and all sorts of stuff like that. All of the themes going on here. You could just write an essay and it would be way shorter if you wanted to just get some ideas down on a page. But if you're making a game or telling a story, you need some of these aesthetic trappings laid on top. And in some ways the Epitaph is the same, because a more dry puzzle would not stick out to people as much, and they wouldn't stop and stare and like start to think, what the hell does this mean? But in terms of Kinzo talking about the Epitaph just broadly, he's set up a magic in which, should the riddle be solved by Beatrice, in itself bringing Beatrice out as a person who is distinct, Beatrice will then get the gold, inherit everything. He has not written a will to this effect, but the Epitaph, as will be suggested later, serves as his will in that once she has that gold, she is the master of the island, she simultaneously will get a massive pile of gold and the ability to destroy the island in one go. Of course, if the adult Kinzo children instead find that stuff, they will just take it, and then the miracle will not happen because Beatrice will not solve it and get the opportunity. I am unclear on what Kinzo is saying about offering up other people's lives. It's sometimes hard, like I was saying earlier, to know how much Kinzo's sincerely believing in the black magic and how much is just evoking the aesthetic. Because offering up people's lives could mean, like, you'll let the family be ruined, you'll let all the money go. Because all these people are ruining their businesses. If they don't find this cash cow, they are not going to survive very well. So, by losing the gold, they don't have access to those problems anymore. If Beatrice does in fact get to have the house and gets to suddenly be the heir, they could all be tossed out because Beatrice will be in control of all these things. Like with the kill earlier, though it obviously reads as something violent and ritualistic in that sense, I often don't get the sense that Kinzo really means it. He's just talking in very evocative ways. He also talks about people using his bones for soup. He's really not a very literal man. For the epitaph itself, at least at this juncture, and I'll probably look back over it now and then to see if anything new develops, honestly I do feel like a lot of it is quite straightforwardly clues to the mechanics of the puzzle that is solved later. I didn't even remotely solve it my first time through. It involved some knowledge of kanji, some looking up of maps, not stuff that was a little beyond me. But the part I'm interested in reading right now is the final section, where it talks about the witch's treasures. So obviously the gold is a pretty obvious treasure to have achieved. Resurrecting the souls of all the dead is an interesting one, because that could either refer to just the puzzle itself and the idea that you killed the millionaire sign to get in here, and then you resurrect that in that you are yourself becoming a millionaire. If it's supposed to refer to the resurrection of Beatrice, is it in some sense trying to imply that all Beatrice is being resurrected? That it is not just a new Beatrice coming, but the previous lives of Beatrice are coming back to this person? And then the lost love, presumably about Kinzo and Beatrice and his longing romance for the woman he has lost twice now. But the most curious one to me is putting the witch to sleep. Because this is a charitable reading, but is Kinzo implying that he'd actually be willing to let Beatrice go? It is kind of up in the air what Kinzo's intentions would be with a resurrected Beatrice. Because obviously with the first Beatrice, he had a romantic relationship. We don't really get anything from her perspective, so we can't realistically speak to it in particular. But to be generous, let's just assume it was a fine and happy relationship. Let's trust people at this point. He then has a child with this Beatrice. The original Beatrice does not survive, and so with his child Beatrice, bad things happen. He grooms her to be his new Beatrice, and we will know that will lead to raping her too to produce the next Beatrice. Deeply, deeply immoral, shameful acts from Kinzo here. And it is reasonable to be concerned that with the third Beatrice, Kinzo would perpetuate the cycle. As with any story about abuse, pretty much, the idea of the cycle of abuse is going to be present here. This is a particularly egregious case because of the idea that the cycle is being perpetuated by the same person but two new generations. But is the last line of the epitaph possibly indicating a break from that cycle? Regardless of what we think would actually happen, is Kinzo trying to insinuate that he is looking to make amends with Beatrice? That he is crying when screaming Beatrice's name because he understands the sin he has committed and he wants to make amends? He wants one last smile from Beatrice, he wants to apologize, and then he will put the witch to sleep. He will let her go. Because later we will often hear about Beatrice being referred to as the Endless Witch. And endless will not be in the sense of immortal, endless will be in the sense of not being allowed to end. Kinzo will not let her go. That is a big problem. And we'll likewise see that with Battler come too, but Battler will learn to let go and accept that he does not have the same Beatrice. Kinzo has lived a long time since losing Beatrice II. That is a lot of time to rethink mistakes, reckon with what you've done, and also, it is not impossible that he would say that this is what he wants, but not necessarily be able to follow that with his actions when the time comes. People may have noble intentions or a wish to make amends and want to be a better person, and therefore that's the kind of thing they might commit to paper or to plaque. But that's not the same as saying that we think he would probably be a stand-up guy when meeting his grandchild. On that cheery note, I have had a lot to say about this part and definitely some ongoing questions to keep interrogating. I'm looking forward to our next section where we are going to actually be hearing from Beatrice pretty soon, I think, which may come up in the next spoiler episode. But that's all for the moment anyway. Thank you for watching, and talk to you next time.